Libros Schmibros is a podcast exploring the people, books, movies, and ideas that Angelinos care about in a thoughtful way that even New Yorkers can understand. We're coming to you from Libros Schmibros, our nonprofit bilingual lending library in Boyle Heights, on the west coast of the country and the east bank of the mighty Los Angeles River. Hi, this is David Kipen, broadcasting live from a reasonable facsimile of Libros Schmibros over my shoulder at 103 North Boyle Avenue in the heart of Boyle Heights. We're a nonprofit lending library. Please come see us whenever you're able to stray out of doors again. We put books into people's hands, and occasionally we put a book as good as this one into people's hands. Yes, can you see this? I think you can. This is Mike Davis's new book, Set the Night on Fire, LA in the 60s. And it's actually by Mike and a really talented colleague by the name of John Wiener. But I don't have to reach far to find books by Mike Davis. There's this one, Ecology of Fear, which is indispensable for students of Los Angeles. And there is The Monster at the Door, which is highly relevant right now because Mike saw the pandemic coming from a long way away. This is a book that's easily a decade old. And then there's City of Quartz, which I'm ashamed not to be holding up because, of course, it's the indispensable volume for understanding Los Angeles alongside maybe Carrie McWilliams' An Island on the Land, but it's not a very long list. And so it's a treat to have Mike here to talk with us, though you wouldn't know it from all the talking I'm doing. Let me just, by way of starting, say this, which is there was a 25th anniversary celebration of City of Quartz that took place a couple of years ago that I think you weren't able to join, Mike. But Christopher,
no, they wouldn't pay my fare, David.
I would have taken it out of my...
I only live in San Diego. I just wanted gas fare.
I would have sent you airfare. I would have come to get you on a magic carpet. But I was not the organizer of this event. This was put together by Christopher Hawthorne, who was then the architecture critic for the LA Times and is now design and architecture advisor to Eric Garcetti, the mayor of Los Angeles, and we've been seeing a lot of on TV lately. Anyway, I got off a line there that I was probably optimistic in uttering, which is that City of Quartz was not a self-fulfilling prophecy, but a self-averting prophecy, meaning it painted such a dystopian view of Los Angeles's future that our sheer terror at the possibility enabled us to find a different future. But it's just possible that some people find LA dystopian in a slightly different way. Mike, what do you think? How does the LA of the present, from your vantage, compare with the LA you were predicting, or at least suggesting in the 1990s?
Well, actually, in City of Quartz, what I was trying to argue is that both the Gidget at the beach, downtown Hollywood, Mulholland Drive images of LA on one side, and Godzilla stomping on the city or volcanoes erupting under Melrose, form a kind of unity, and neither, of course, accurately characterize this great working class city at all. In terms of the changes I've seen, I mean, the most fundamental and important change has been the success of the labor crusades of the late 1980s, 1990s, which after I came back to Los Angeles from Ireland and England at the end of the 80s, I was able to attend the demonstrations and managed to get arrested a couple of times. But it's transformed city politics. Another thing that amazed me when I came back is, I don't know what you'd call it, maybe grassroots gentrification. I mean, if you go to what were once the really tired working class neighborhoods, flatland neighborhoods of the city, they were suddenly springing back to life. People were painting their houses. They were, planting corn or tomatoes. And
which neighborhoods are you thinking of?
What?
Which neighborhoods are you thinking of?
Oh, all through South LA and Alameda corridor communities. I mean, there was a great fatality in the city because, of course, when Latinos come to the United States, whether from Mexico or Central America or from South America, they bring a different urbanism.
And you wrote a book called Magical Urbanism, didn't you, with this for a thesis?
Yeah, that indeed. But trying to argue that, you know, they have given an importance to public space, to the outdoors, to sharing community life, which of course, you know, wasn't entirely missing in the city by any means in the old East Side or in Black Los Angeles. But the weight they added to that and the creative energies they brought was infinitely more important than anything that my former colleagues at the Southern California Institute of Architecture have designed or built. I'm not, it's not a critique of them. You know, I love some of them. But it was just a huge fact that was very little commented on at the time. Now, on the other side, of course, all the social conditions, all the economic precariousness that produced the explosion in 1992, which, remember, wasn't just a reaction to Rodney King. It was a reaction to a recession that was cutting right through the heart of the poorest immigrant communities in Los Angeles. All those conditions remain. And of course, they've been greatly exacerbated by the unaffordability of housing, which has reached almost, you know, an impossible stage, which is why in some ways the urban crisis in Southern California has migrated from the central city to the older 1940s, 1950s suburbs. And of course, there...
You're thinking now of...
Excuse me?
You're thinking now of neighborhoods like...
Oh, I mean, you know, like the eastern San Gabriel Valley, but the Inland Empire, the town I was born in Montana, ended up being kind of one half Orange County commuter suburbs, and the other half inner city people who come out, got jobs in warehouses, and tried to find what, you know, what was left of the suburban dream for them, you know, good schools, safer neighborhoods. And of course, the Inland Empire was one of the two national epicenters of the housing meltdown in 2008. And tens of thousands of people lost their homes, and any little savings they may have accumulated. And so this is a story that, again, that's hardly ever touched on. Has been this great migration to the suburbs, and the tragedy that so many people, instead of finding the things they were looking for, those better schools, those jobs, those safer neighborhoods, have found the opposite, and now find themselves, you know, 100 miles away, maybe from, you know, the old neighborhood that they left. And many of those old neighborhoods, of course, now have property values that, you know, are so unimaginable and so surreal. And of course, gentrification is a disease that brings lots of other things in its wake. I mean, I'm particularly sensitive to the claim that Silver Lake is now the East Side.
Believe you me, we in Boyle Heights have the same sensitivity.
Well, you're endangered. You're endangered as well. My wife's Mexican, and she's been involved with artists, and our equivalent of Boyle Heights here, and Barrio Logan, and we've had an argument for years because she's so excited that artists, young Latino artists, are moving in. But I've been rooting for bigger and deadlier street gangs, because the artists, of course, I mean, they come with the best of intentions to, you know, invigorate the community, but then they end up getting evicted by the landlords. And pretty soon you have rich people from Phoenix, Arizona,
Ugh.
who are the major, together with Chinese real estate investment companies, they're the major investors in downtown real estate. San Diego has an almost completely dormitory residential downtown with, prices prices to the moon. But I mean, we live in a period where almost no neighborhood is been off limits to this. So it'll be very interesting to see as we move back in history to the Great Depression, what will happen then. Will it force more people out of their homes and their neighborhoods? Will it slow the the expansion of developers and flippers and all those different species of people that we wish some great white shark would gobble up? And I don't know.
Do you see another depression on the horizon?
It's not on the horizon. It's here. I mean, we've returned to a state of mass immiseration in this country, which isn't surprising given that most studies show that about half of Americans have about $500 or less in the bank to get them through. This is an extinction event for tens of thousands, potentially hundreds of thousands of small businesses. The gig economy, a lot of it will disappear permanently. Yeah. And if one of the results of this is a tendency toward deglobalization, that is toward the repatriation of factories and units of production that were formerly located offshore, if they come back home, it's not going to revivify the industrial working class, because it's absolutely certain that what will happen is increased automation. So I foresee an extended period of economic stagnation and high unemployment. Brings us closer to the world that my favorite movie auteur.
Which one?
John Carpenter. I don't know if you recall a science fiction film called They Live.
Absolutely. The one where all of the Republicans turned out to be venomous aliens in disguise?
Yes.
For a second, I thought
But most of the working class were essentially living in one mega homeless encampment.
For a second,
feeling that this was, somehow their fault. I mean, the good news, I think, in Los Angeles, but all over the country, is that this event is not only radicalized health workers, some of whom, like the nurses union, have been in the forefront of progressive movement for some years now, but it's going to lead to a general upsurge of labor, at least by people who still have their jobs. And I foresee Jeff Bezos being there in his castle, wherever he is, surrounded by angry warehouse people and delivery drivers wielding pitchforks. And
Cuauhtemoc in particular was asking about the potential impact of the virus on social movements and housing and homelessness. I wonder, since you've outlined some of these potential consequences and maybe even the reaction against them, do you see do you see more sunshine or noir as these forces come into collision over the next months and years?
I see alternative outcomes. In other words, I see one set of possibilities, I see another. This is a battlefield. And it's definitely, in a socioeconomic sense, a new age. And it generates great opportunities to move forward. But of course, it also raises, the threat of further assumption of power by the Republicans, further undermining of democracy. The one thing I think has been missing, however, on the progressive side. And in the Sanders campaign and in the Warren campaigns, is really any of the sense of internationalism. That, I think, in retrospect, was the great bragging point of the left in the last several generations, not just the 60s, but the Central American Solidarity Movement, for instance, and in the 1980s. I didn't hear world poverty mentioned once in the debates. No. Of course, with coronavirus, we stand on the edge of what could be the real massacre, which is it spread through populations where compromised immunity is probably the case for almost a majority of people. Africa, 24 million people with HIV, millions more with tuberculosis. Poor access or none at all to sanitation. It's ridiculous to go to a slum like Kibera, which is 1 million people in Nairobi, and tell people you have to wash your hands every hour with soap, or that you have to practice social distancing when the density is maybe 40,000 people per square mile. But above all, the thing that will amplify and increase mortality is malnutrition. And over the last 20 years, the number of African children, young children, suffering from stunted growth has increased by many millions. Everywhere else in the world, it's been reduced or become very rare, but it's increasing. Malnutrition is a major co-infection of coronavirus.
And of course, LA being the international city it is, it doesn't feel as if those places are safely on the other side of anybody's planet. I dare say that the consequences of that will be felt by all the immigrants whose families are in all of those places still.
Well, I can almost see the consequences from my yard because we live within sight of our sister city, Tijuana, where half my wife's family lives, and dreadful things are going to happen down there. First of all, to the refugees living in these, frankly squalid camps or homeless, but to people as a whole. And some of the leaders in the Chicano community here and some Latin American scholars have been writing to Governor Newsom saying, look, it's now that you're able to send masks and stuff back to other parts of the country, got to think about giving aid on the southern border of California.
That would be beautiful. Hey, Mike, I got to tell you, you've got a lot to learn about promoting a book.
I've never been good at promoting a book, except in one case.
What was that?
Well, it was City Quartz, which I thought was such a deadly read. I mean, a really dull book. I mean, who wants to read almost 100 pages about homeowner associations and battles over picking up dog poo and so on? So I got this wonderful photographer who worked with me to create this really garish cover with the menacing looking downtown federal jail. And then I had a photograph of myself making me look like I was, tough little boxer from, far from the case. So that was packaged successfully, though. Still, at the end of the day, I was utterly shocked that anybody bothered to read this book.
Well, I mean, you had your secret weapon going for you, which I don't think you get nearly enough credit for, which is, it's no coincidence you were on the UC Riverside creative writing faculty, weren't you? At least cross-listed with the history faculty. You're a hell of a writer.
I'm retired from UCR, which is an absolutely terrific MFA writing program.
Yeah.
But when I wrote City of Quartz, my major resource, aside from the fact that I read the LA Times in every regional edition
Yeah.
for most of the 20th century, actually now. I think I've read it all. But my real secret resource in writing the book is I was very OD'd on intellectuals. So I went back and a friend of mine was dying. He'd been on the road, heavy duty truck driver for far too long. So I just walked into his job and I spent 8 months hauling blanket wrap furniture to the Bay Area, Vegas, and so on. But the thing is that I'd pick up this furniture at literally scores, maybe 100 different furniture factories in LA, and hidden away in amazing, places.
Yeah.
So I got a long look at the sweatshop economy, and I also worked with a terrific group of young Latino guys, and so those insights were very important in writing.
But you also have to learn how to take a compliment for, not even for a historian, just for any writer of nonfiction. Your prose is, I think, top shelf. Now, I'd be curious to ask you, how important do you think rhetoric and language are to social history? Because you seem sometimes to be doing it so well, you're doing something completely different.
I'm laughing because learning to write was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. I was in my early 30s when I finally began to write, and still was incredibly difficult for me. Which is why in writing classes, I tell my students, I said, look, if I can learn to write, you can too, but you got to be willing to go to the coalface every morning. It's very, very difficult. Young architects, and for that matter, dancers, playwrights, they expect it's going to be difficult. They expect to sweat. The problem is now a lot of people just go to MFA programs to basically show and tell and impress their friends. I remain convinced everybody can write, but you have to have a realistic understanding of what it takes. My writing's also evolved over the years, from almost impossible to very difficult, to now at times almost enjoyable.
Now, how, other than hacking away at the coalface yourself, did you learn?
Well, that's what I did.
But I mean, who taught? Did you have teachers? Did you have at least models?
No. Writers, teachers, or books.
Well, what books made a writer out of you?
Well, that's kind of interesting. My sources are really obscure. One of the people who had the greatest influence on me, excuse me, is a Welsh socialist historian named Gwen Williams.
Really?
Who attempted and largely succeeded in writing the entire history of Wales from the beginning of the Neolithic down to the miners' strike under Thatcher. But he was a marvelous storyteller as well as historian. So I've always been attracted to griots, great storytellers.
Well,
of course, has made me one reason I could never possibly write a memoir, because of my tendency to turn everything into a better story to tell guys at the local saloon, and I'm often amazed when people tell me, "Yeah, that really happened, like you said, Mike." And I say, "What? Are you kidding? Did it really? Oh, wow."
Well, of course,
I distrust memory in general. So in writing this book with John Wiener, Set the Night on Fire, I tried to stick almost entirely to written sources or people being interviewed who had exceptional memories, like Raoul Reese, who died, unfortunately.
The editor of La Raza, right?
Yeah, yeah. He was an extraordinary guy. And his memory of things was, absolutely sharp. People like that I trusted. But me and my best friend, who's uh, working class Jewish boxer. He's still fighting. The guy is like 75 years old. He's still sparred. It's ridiculous. But he and I mean, we're like, I don't know if we even like each other, but we're kind of genetically linked these days. He's my brother, and we're so used to telling wild and woolly stories. But he's my major spell check because. When it gets to things involving like our friendships with people in the Panthers or events that we were both in.
Gotcha. Now, did you conduct a lot of those interviews yourself, or did you leave that to your LA leg man, John Weiner?
Well, a lot of the crucial interviews that I intended to conduct became impossible because I was diagnosed with cancer 4 years ago, and then that led to the discovery of a second totally unrelated cancer. So I've been basically housebound or unable to travel beyond the city limits of San Diego. Since then, I wasn't able to. I conducted initial interviews, but John really came to the rescue of the project because I realized I could continue writing basically the narrative of Black-Brown liberation, but counterculture. Look, I was the last person I ever, that I knew well into the 70s who still had a crew cut. People suspected that I was a cop. I never smoked dope. I mean,
It's not too late. I mean, if you've got an illness, maybe now would be the time. Do you mind if I ask about your health now?
Well, I'm roadkill if I ever get the virus. I'll tell you that. But I'm a survivor. I've had exceptionally good luck because at one point it looked it looked pretty bad. I was tearing my last bad jokes to tell.
Did you have any last words ready that you weren't able to use?
Oh, I thought about last words, but all that comes to mind is "fuck the bourgeoisie." I know you can't put that on air. You're going to have to scratch it out.
Yeah, there goes my contract with CBS.
Yeah.
Okay. So
sorry.
If you could come back to LA at some point not long from now, what would you visit first? What do you miss most about LA?
Well, the things I miss are all missing. They're gone. I had Linnell George came to see me. She's a wonderful writer who started off in the LA Weekly and then worked with the LA Times, now teaching at Loyola.
Yeah.
And it was a way about so many things, that were gone, things that were vitally important to us. And it's a little like I wrote about in City of Quartz, where the landmarks of people's lives are just regularly removed. So you have great difficulty establishing not only personal continuity, personal memory, but continuity of community memory. Though I must say, there's one huge exception to that, and it's where your bookstore is located.
Lending library, but don't let me interrupt a compliment.
No, I mean, the distinctive thing about the East Side, and it reminds me of a short period of time I spent in Quebec. And Quebec's national slogan is, "I remember who I am."
Oh.
And against the idea of a kind of rootless Los Angeles where nobody really knows where they live, and it goes by some kind of vague name. People on the East Side know exactly where they live and who they are. And in some ways, it's the most culturally conservative community imaginable, but in a great sense, a good sense. And it has a long history of fighting like hell to prevent the removal of those essential landmarks in community history, communal existence.
Well, Libros Schmibros is fortunate enough to be in a building from 1889 in the Boyle Hotel with a plaque on the side to prove it. So I'm curious if you could, if not commemorate standing landmarks, if you could hang a plaque on sites that used to house particular places of interest, either in general or to activism in the 1960s. What places come to mind?
Oh, well, Priya Coffee Shop on the east side where...
Was that Frida as in Frida Kahlo?
Huh?
Was that Frida as in Frida Kahlo?
No, Priya, I think it was called. Priya. Yeah, I could be wrong. Somebody on the east side should correct me, but it's where the Brown Berets, were formed. The high schools should all have monuments to the students in the 60s who blew them out. I often got in trouble years ago because I kept advocating that we should particularly commemorate bad events. It should be a historical marker to where the Chinese were massacred in 1871 downtown. There should be a major memorial to the Watts insurrection and to people who died. I met a wonderful Japanese American guy who teaches at UCLA, and he had this astonishing family album of billboards in what's today West Hollywood, but they were all over the city, and they were saying "bash a Jap." There were no Japs wanted in this neighborhood. People forget that the public landscape of racism and intolerance. It was hard to go around without encountering signs of it. It wasn't that much different from the Deep South.
Of course, some of the most useful landmarks we have of that era or any other are the books that come out of them. I wonder, from the 1960s in Los Angeles, as you were working on Set the Night on Fire, were there particular books, fiction and nonfiction, or anything else that you found yourself going back to, learning from?
Well, first of all, I've gone back over the years periodically to John Rechy.
Oh.
And it's City of Night, isn't it?
That's the first and the major one, yeah.
It's an extraordinary novel that hopefully people are still reading, because he's a major LA writer. There's a history. There's several histories written right afterward by journalists of the 1965 rebellion, and there's one by Robert Conant, Conot.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like Nights of Fire, Rivers of Blood. It has some ridiculous title, but it actually is the view from the community. He interviewed and he interviewed hundreds of people in the community, and really he gives it a presentation of its side. It's the most accurate account of those events. And then there was a guy who I celebrate in the book, who's otherwise, unfortunately, too forgotten, named Paul Bullock. Paul Bullock was a labor economist at the Institute of Industrial Relations at UCLA. And he was part of a stellar group of left New Deal people who ran that. It was kind of the graduate school for the LA labor movement. But Paul became integrally involved in the life of South Central, and particularly of Watts, who was also a great jazz fan.
Oh.
And he wrote this book where I think it's called, People of Watts Speak Out. And all he did was act as facilitator and editor. And The book is just the voices of people, a real cross-section of the community. I've always thought that was also an exceptional book.
Well, maybe now in this day of online PDFing and even print on demand, some of these books could come back. I would love to be able to lay hands on them. I noticed in the book you give a good juicy chapter to the Los Angeles Free Press, which I've actually been teaching out of. I'm using some of Harlan Ellison's old TV columns and Liza Williams' personal columns for my students, where I'm teaching 60s and 70s journalism. Would you talk just for a minute about the Freep and its legacy? And
well, I mean, John wrote that chapter. He'd be the best person to talk to, but he reminds people, this was the largest underground paper in the country, and it had constant on-the-ground reporting. For instance, in August 1965, the LA Times had this incredible headline. It was something called like barbarism in the city or savagery in the city. The Freep had coverage, but its headline was "The People of Watts Speak." So particularly in the era when the LA Times remained such a reactionary institution, I mean, the Freep was the major source of alternative news, as well as strange and wonderful writing. There's also the People's World, which was the West Coast communist paper, which had some great people on it, and probably long forgotten. But it was every week I'd pick up the Freep, and I'd get the People's World, and that was how I understood LA in the days when I was there in the 1960s.
This sounds like an anthology waiting to happen. I hope you or somebody gets around to it. Tell me, what was it like to be part of the movement in the 1960s? I mean, apart from success or failure, was it exciting? Did you feel as if you were, living out history?
At times I was terrified. I mean, I have to tell you this, and I think everybody was. I remember one year I went to 3 different Black Panther, funerals, and if you were stopped, very often, they'd charge you with armed robbery just to hold you for 72 hours and terrorize you. Of course, for activists in the Black brown communities, it was even worse. But then there were moments of, yes, a sheer exaltation.
Like when?
Well, actually from the first time I set foot in LA, which was just before the Watts Rebellion in August 1965. And I met a guy named Levi Kingston, who is one of the 2 people the book is dedicated to. Yeah. And Levi's a wonderful and very important figure, not only in this period, but down to the day he died, unfortunately, a month ago. He was in a nursing home writing petitions to politicians about the miserable conditions in the nursing home and trying to organize people in the nursing home. But it was through Levi's eyes that I saw Los Angeles. He introduced me to a lot of the people most active in the South Central community. But Levi knew everybody, and he knitted them all together. He loved introducing one group of people to another. But he was also LA's kind of constant gardener. He just spent his entire lifetime organizing. He never sought money, managed to be everywhere at once, but didn't drive. And the times I spent with him were, they were wonderful. And then there's the person who was the single most important intellectual and moral influence on my life, even though we fought like cats and dogs forever. And that was Dorothy Healy, who was the unorthodox leader of the very unorthodox Southern California district of the Communist Party. And in writing the book, or at least my share of the book, was a constant conversation and debate with Dorothy.
Mm.
And I could hear in the back of my mind Dorothy saying, "Oh, Bubala, you're such an infantile leftist."
Well, I'm sure your FBI file isn't as fat as hers, but what's in it? Have you ever looked?
Yeah, I looked in it. It was written by idiots. For instance, one of our family's closest friends, San Diego, was an old Yugoslav butcher named Lee Gregovic, who'd been a communist in the 30s and 40s. And my father had a bad heart attack in high school, so I quit for half a year to work full time, delivering meat. And I used to deliver meat to Lee. The only job he could find was being a cook way out in the backcountry, East San Diego, and always pour me a little bit of red wine and then pat me on the back and said, "Read Marx." He had never read Marx, and most, in fact, rank and file communists hadn't done it. But somehow the FBI heard this story. So they launched into this frenzied investigation. They spell his name wrong. Instead of the Croatian version of his name, it's the Russian version of the name. And think that I'm, being controlled by this guy in the KGB named Gregovic. And the whole FBI file, at least the parts that weren't blacked out, was just like this. These guys were incompetent clerks and little more than that. And looking back on it, I say, thank God they weren't more competent, that they weren't smart. But universally, they tended to be dumb. And in later years, I discovered having several cops as friends or as students, just how universally hated the FBI has always been by the local cops.
Well, I wish we could spend all afternoon together, and I want to spend at least this much more. Tell me, what's next? I know you finally put a 600-page brick of a masterpiece to bed. What do you want to write now?
Well, I have one remaining project which I hope to finish, and it's called Star-Spangled Leviathan, and it's a history of American nationalism, but a very different view on nationalism and how one should analyze nationalism. I'm particularly interested in the political economy of nationalism and how successively in American history, coalitions of different groups with very profound economic interests have joined together to advance one set of ideas about citizenship, suffrage, foreign policy, attitudes toward the oppression of people and Black people in the South, and so on. And I've actually written 125 pages of this. So if I don't have to spend the rest of my life writing and talking about coronavirus, that's what I'll be doing.
Well, I promise I won't ask any more questions about coronavirus, though it's one among a zillion subjects I could keep talking to you about until the cows come home. I do have Star-Spangled Leviathan. I'm not going to be able to get that out of my head. I mean, it sounds a little bit like City of Quartz, not because of the title, but in the sense that, it's sunshine and noir. Nationalism is, crimes are committed in its name, and yet it has the potential to be a force for good. Is that more or less what you're finding?
I belong to people who are anti-nationalists, pure and simple, 100%. I love the popular cultures and the people of this country, but I've never been in any way, shape, or form a patriot, and I've never believed that the agenda of human liberation can be advanced while waving a flag over our heads. It puts me certainly in a small minority of people, and it's produced great difficulties because many of my oldest friends, are not leftists, never have been. They're Vietnam vets, they're construction workers. Most of my big family, most of them in Seattle, the same, the same way. But that's where I stand. And I think right now, if you look at the world and you see how every country has approached the crisis in a totally nationalistic way, putting for instance, into doubt the future of the European Union, but also of the UN organizations and international organizations. I mean, for Trump, for instance, America first means Africa last. And I think this is the world that we have to confront strictly from the standpoint of humanity united as internationalists. To some extent, I've been very worried that the American left, and of course, I could not be more excited to see a generation of kids who identify with some version of socialism or social democracy. But there is a tendency toward a kind of America firstism on the left. And I think one of the...
On the left, who are you thinking of?
Well, I'm just thinking of a discourse that doesn't bother to address conditions in other countries, that buys into patriotism, has to always put the American flag pin on their lapels. But because one of the great qualities of the American left, and the left of my generation, made gigantic mistakes, stupid mistakes. But one of the great qualities of the American left has always been its internationalism and its willingness to put oppressed peoples and the rest of the world in the forefront of struggles. And what's happening now reminds me a little bit of what happened during the Second World War when the Communist Party was dissolved. There was a chairman named Earl Browder. The communist slogan being, communism is 20th century Americanism. No, that's not a route I want to go down. I have actually teaching in a Catholic college. I find a lot in common with some of the liberation theology people and with people who take the Pope's side. I mean, if you look at it, the Pope is virtually the only major public figure, maybe apart from the Dalai Lama, who talks always and almost exclusively of human unity and human solidarity, which of course gets him in immense trouble with groups like the right-wing hierarchy in parts of the US.
Speaking of the American flag, certainly one used to wave, I believe, in the mouth of an eagle next to a globe in the lobby of the Los Angeles Times. I wonder if it's true. Weren't you at work at one point on a biography of General Harrison Gray Otis, the founder of the Times?
Yes, I was originally going to write a history of the McNamara brothers who blew the Times building up, which was a huge tragedy for labor in Los Angeles. But I found Otis a far more compelling character after I discovered, for instance, that he grew up in an abolitionist family.
Really?
He and his wife had been young radicals at the beginning of the Civil War. He was amongst an officer corps that became radicalized and became largely abolitionist by the end of the war.
Really?
In other words, he was a radical Democrat, typical of the time.
What the hell happened?
Well, this is what's so fascinating to me, because it's a very large untold story, is how is it that, these idealists and radical Democrats of the 1860s ended up becoming the robber barons of the 1880s and the 1890s. So I was wanting to use Otis to study this larger, phenomena, because in some ways you could almost say that they were the new left of the Lincoln era, and many of the labor struggles in Los Angeles would pit Otis as proprietor of the Times against union leaders who themselves had almost identical biographies, had been union officers, idealists, abolitionists like him. And also simply from the standpoint of storytelling, you can't get better in Otis's life. He ended up, because he belonged to this regiment, the 23rd Ohio, whose other officers included Bill McKinley and Rutherford B. Hayes, as well as a couple of guys who became senators and governors. It's just an astonishing group of people. And he's always pissed off that he never, as Hayes and then McKinley became president, he never got the kind of government positions he wanted. And the most he got really was during the Grant administration. He was appointed to be the collector chief for the Pribilof Islands. The Pribilof Islands are these tiny islands in the Bering Sea that have one of the largest fur-bearing seal populations in the world.
Mike, is this story going to stay untold?
I don't know, but just to give you one more tidbit, while he's on the island, he fell in love with this underling's wife, had this torrid affair. But his life goes on like this, not just his wars against labor, but he also was the king of the Mexicali Valley for a long time with his son-in-law, Norman Chandler. They owned all the land in the Mexicali Valley and played a large role supporting the counter-revolutionary side during the Mexican Revolution.
Well, like a lot of people, I only ever read the first chapter, and of course, my mouth has been watering ever since. Was it, which I think you did publish it maybe in New Left Review? What was it? Your illness that interfered with it?
No, it's with several other projects that excited me, but nobody else. I had to leave it behind. It didn't really arouse much interest. The other book I wish I'd written, which I only published an article about in the Sierra Club Journal, is looking at the World War II home front as the greatest green experiment in American history.
Ooh.
And far beyond victory gardens. It involved things like there was a movement, there was a part of the wartime administration was a section devoted to rational fashion. Okay, because you had to conserve fabrics. So how did you keep fabrics attractive, but at the same time keep them within rational limits of consumption? Hitchhiking was encouraged during the war. The Republican Party of Colorado vowed in 1942 that they would only hitchhike and never drive to rallies. All kinds of communal values that have been lost or in danger of being lost became popular again. Well, it was an astonishing moment, actually.
If I can't find the chapter you did publish, if I can't Google it up tonight, you'll be hearing from me tonight so I can chase it down. What do you think of the new El Segundo LA Times? You said earlier you haven't missed a morning of it, since you were practically, out in trousers.
Well, yeah, I mean, as many radicals have in LA's past, I have issues. I had serious issues with the LA Times, and they had serious issues with me. No, I like the New Times, but what is devastating, really, is the absence now of investigative journalism on the community level. I mean, the LA Times, even the bad old days, had 9 or 10 regional editions and had like the West San Fernando Valley, East San Fernando. And each of those editions had a small dedicated group of journalists, not just reporting high school football scores, but doing investigative studies. And so now I think a larger part of the 8 million people in Los Angeles County, there's nobody out there actively investigating what's going on at their city council meeting, what's happening with developers and land use in their communities. And that, you aggregate that nationally, and it's disastrous. It undermines, democracy in the most basic and fundamental, ways. So, yeah, I enjoy reading the Times, and I particularly enjoy some of the younger journalists who write for it.
Any bylines in particular come to mind?
Let me see. Younger Chicano journalist, and of course, I read Steve Lopez, often with great enjoyment, sometimes, with frustration. But he's an extraordinarily effective lightning rod for popular feeling, in the city, and that's what makes his column, so effective and kind of, required reading. Sports page, I think, has deteriorated, but
but then again, the Dodgers have deteriorated.
Yeah,
Steve Lopez has been good to us at Libros. He's definitely a hero in our neck of the woods. Before I let you go, we are, in fact, a nonprofit bilingual storefront lending library, and having written a book about the 1960s, you should probably be waiting for a question about the bookstores and libraries of the era. Were there particular stores where people could go and find stories they weren't getting anywhere else?
Of course. I mean, the first one I discovered was Papa Box, which was across from the USC campus. It later moved to Santa Monica. It was a wonderful bookstore. And of course, all the amazing used bookstores. There seemed to be an infinity of used bookstores at one point. But what I recall the greatest loss was Midnight Special. Midnight Special started off as literally a little left bookstore in a closet. It was the tiniest bookstore you ever saw. And thanks to Margie, who managed and then owned it, it became one of the great independent bookstores in America. And I can't even think about Midnight Special without, my stomach being, churned by what happened. I managed for a while the Progressive Bookstore, which was the CP bookstore on 7th and Union, until an unfortunate incident where we had this guy who was going around taking notes on all the books. And we were very close. The FBI headquarters was just a block away in those days. And my friend Ron and I sized him up and kind of get him out of the bookstore. And he started complaining. So we pushed him a little out of the bookstore. And then later that night, my boss, Dorothy Healy, called me up and said, "Well, Bubula, you've always wanted to be a heroic proletarian. Now's your chance, because you just assaulted the Soviet cultural attaché to the United States." Of course, in the bookstore, spying, because I had books on Trotsky, China, all this stuff that they didn't want you to read. So that started my career as a heroic worker.
Well, you can always pull a shift at Libros Schmibros. You have only to ask. I would love to. I'll never forget when City of Los Angeles sanitation truck pulled up to the curb outside of Libros, and the driver ran in while the truck was left idling at the curb and said, "I've only got a minute. Have you got some Trotsky?" I should ask you, as an experienced purveyor of books yourself, do you have any parting advice for those of us who are still putting books into people's hands in Boyle Heights?
Well, I have very esoteric advice about two books that you won't be able to find.
Sounds like a challenge.
Okay. One of them is called what's it called? Where the Grass is Greener, something like this, written by Ward Moore, who's one of the great bohemian radical writers of all time. And it's mainly known for this novel he wrote about what would happen if the South won the Civil War, come Jubilee. But his first book is a Jewish version of On the Road. In fact, I've often wondered if Kerouac didn't crib part of it, all set against the background of what became an apocalyptic department store strike at the beginning of the war. And the second book, this was written in 1940, I think. The second book was written in 1932, and it's called Flutter of an Eyelid by Myron Brennick. Brennick was the first out of the closet and also very successful gay writer. And this book is a roman à clef. That is, it's really about actual people. And its plot is, I mean, I've always loved The Loved One.
Yves Lemois.
Which is a hilarious novel. But this goes, way beyond that. It's in a different and more eccentric orbit around Los Angeles. And one of the opening scenes, the protagonist is a kind of tired, very aristocratic New York writer in kind of, I don't know, the Henry James mode or something. And his publisher sends him to to Los Angeles to rejuvenate himself. And he goes to a cocktail party at a beach community, which is actually about a real group that existed, kind of headed by Jake Zeitlin, who was one of LA's great book dealers in the 20s and 30s. And the first person he meets is this beautiful but somewhat dour woman. And she says, "What do you do?" He says, "I'm a novelist." "What do you do?" She says, "I give and receive pain." I mean, the novel keeps going. Amy Semple McPherson appears, convinces the world that the sailor she's having an affair with is Jesus Christ. And ultimately, of course, LA's washed out to sea or something like that. It's an obligatory catastrophe at the end. It's a fabulous book.
Oh, it sounds wonderful. All I know about it up till now is it's excerpted in the Library of America Writing Los Angeles anthology, and you write about it in Ecology of Fear in that wonderful chapter, maybe my favorite chapter of everything I've loved by you, where you read, it sounds like scores of books about the apocalypse in Los Angeles, and tabulate and criticize and critique and delve into them. Books that are long since gone. Do you go ahead?
My model for this is, I'm a jazz buff, and Gunther Schuller is this famous composer, jazz historian, and he wrote this monumental book on swing. But the principle of it is that he decided he had to listen to every extant recording. It took him 15 years. So the approach I took, because there is actually an incredibly helpful bibliography of California fiction, is to read every single disaster book written about Southern California. And the real point of the chapter is the argument that this whole genre of LA Destroyed has consistently a racist subtext, whether it's the Japanese or African Americans. And so this is not an innocent genre at all. One can make the same point actually about Raymond Chandler, whose figure Marlowe is really a kind of proto-fascist, if you think about it.
Hey,
And
hey, hey. I'm
sorry to say it, but he's the small businessman fighting the evil system. And there's also always the racial innuendo in it. His last book in particular is easy to take as being, being anti-Semitic. Now, I read Chandler as much as anybody. It's always struck me the extent to which this has gone unnoticed. And so much of LA fiction, I think you find the similar thing.
well, I go back to the cop, the very sympathetic, multidimensional cop in Red Wind, Ibarra, and I will use him as my alibi for loving Chandler as much as I do. We will put all these recommendations before long, I hope, on the Libros website, because there's nothing I would rather have with me at Libros Schmibros than Mike Davis's guide to fine, if slightly hard to find, writing. Let me
particularly Ward Moore. People should discover Ward Moore. He's the guy. He's LA's, one of LA's two greatest science fiction writers.
I will chase him down. And of course, a proud addition to the LA shelf is your new book, yours and John Wiener's, Set the Night on Fire. How did you decide to use a Doors lyric for the title, by the way?
Oh, I decided it somewhere in the beginning, but I never dreamt that we'd actually get an official permission.
You had to ask the Morrison estate, or had you do that?
No. God, I'm sorry. I have Alzheimer's. The drummer is
Manzarek.
Huh?
Ray Manzarek.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. We we met with him and interviewed him and stuff, and he got behind the project. And I had to apologize to him and say, look, I was the last person on earth to hear of Jim Morrison. I missed all that. And he says, I wish I never heard of Jim Morrison.
Well, if you're having memory trouble, that's the kind of memory trouble that I want, because your mind remains prodigious. Are we in your library, by the way?
Yeah, I tend to give my libraries away. I mean, I buy an awful lot of books, but when I use them, I get rid of them. And basically what I save are some history, and my hobby for a lifetime has been geology. So out of my garage is a whole library of earth science books, and I keep those. But otherwise, I regard books as, necessary tools. I don't really fall into Walter Benjamin's thing about the aura books and so on. And I never reread my own books, which can get very embarrassing. When I get asked questions and I've forgotten, was that chapter in City Horse? Did I really say that? Because I discovered a long time ago, if you don't reread your own books and if you ignore book reviews, then you can move on very quickly from one project to another. And until recent good fortunes, I've always had to struggle to find writing time. So I pretty much stuck to that principle zealously. And I have no intention of reading.
Well, all I can say, Mike,
is Set the Night on Fire either.
All I can say is you don't know what you're missing. And if you ever find any of those necessary tools growing unnecessary to you again, there's nothing I'd rather have than an ex libris Mike Davis shelf to show off in the Libros window.
Okay, would you let me do a final shout out?
Yes, of course, by all means.
All the folks on the East Side, I have so many wonderful memories. So I'm still mourning the fact that the damn public radio station in Pasadena took the Poncho Show off the air.
Oh yes, KCSN.
Oh yeah, that was a real loss, a bad move. No longer anybody to say, hey, and I'm shouting out to all the kids in Pico Rivera who were, it was a wonderful program, like so many things on the East Side. Wonderful.
Unless it found a home on KPFK. I'll have to look that up.
No,
Um,
no, I don't think so.
What a pity. Well, anytime you feel up to making it back to the East Side, Mike, you have the widest of embraces waiting for you at Libros Schmibros. And it's just been a thrill having you as our inaugural guest on the Libros Schmibros podcast. Cuauhtemoc and I and the whole Libros family just couldn't be prouder that you've given us this time. Congratulations on the book. And yes, we will convey your shout out to the whole neighborhood with pride.
Yeah. Thank you so much, David and Cuauhtemoc, for this. It was an honor.
For us as well. So long, Mike.
Bye, David.
So ends another episode of Libros Schmibros, recorded at the bilingual nonprofit Libros Schmibros Lending Library in Boyle Heights. By all means, follow us online in all the old familiar places, or email us via info@libroschmibros.org. By the way, we couldn't do this podcast without the whole Libros team, Cuauhtemoc, Colleen, Diana, and Alberto. And all of them would kill me if I didn't add this. Please consider visiting libroschmibros.org, hitting the donut button, the donate button, and giving us a gift. We put good free books into people's hands 5 days a week here at Libros, right across from Mariachi Plaza, up in the old Boyle Hotel. I'm David Kipen, and there'll always be a free book for you, and thousands more to borrow here at Libros Schmibros.